journey filled with pain. Through the desert of oppression, longing for sweet freedom's reign. It's no easy. It's no easy walk. It's no easy. It's no easy walk. It's no easy walk. It's no easy walk to freedom. It's no easy walk. It's no easy. It's no easy walk. It's no easy. It's no easy walk. It's no easy walk. It's no easy walk to freedom. It's no easy walk.
The people that says, I want to build myself as a people, I want to build, to love, to respect, to create. That is the real Africa. The Africa we let loose in the continental direction. This Africa to come. In times of need, make a sacrifice and raise your hands towards the great mountain, Kirinyaga, and Mogai, the Lord of Nature, will come to your assistance. Thus, Jomo Kenyatta advised all his countrymen. For your peace and serenity, hold on to the land facing Mount Kenya.
The land is the basic source of livelihood among our people. It is where people settle and build their homes. And at the same time, they call it their mother, that the land is the mother.
The land of Kenya is mother to many different peoples, growing crops and grazing cattle, open country without natural borders, difficult to unify or defend against invaders, its peoples already damaged by the slave trade when the first Europeans arrived. Guns against spears could only have one outcome, and soon the British annexed the entire territory. They saw the whole enterprise as part of their civilizing mission to Africa.
Then, in 1891, a new era dawned. On the strength of reports from explorers and missionaries, the British decided to build a railway from the coast westwards to Uganda. Its object, to abolish the slave trade by establishing British administration and to open up the country. Skilled technicians came from Britain, artisans from India, working together and steadily pushing the line westwards across the arid plains to the highlands. With the railway came the first settlers. To this new land, they brought their experience of agriculture in Britain, their capital, and their eagerness to work.
What type of settler is required in East Africa? With the exception of the wastrel and the degenerate, it must be said that all are welcome in Kenya. The capitalist is wanted, so is the skilled workman. Most desirable of all is the man with a small capital who will bring out his wife and make a home.
The present system of taxation, although a good revenue getter, is not sufficiently strong to have much effect on the labor question. And it is more than probable that many natives avoid paying taxes altogether. The following scale of wages may be of interest. For Swahili labor, 10 rupees a month. Kavirondos, 4 rupees. Kikuyus, 2 up to 4 rupees, with posho, depending on physique.
When the first white man came and actually said that Kenya would be a colony, and it was explained to them that it means that the British flag will actually be set not on the houses, but on the land. The people felt offended.
When the white men came and found that the Kikuyu land was very good, some of them, because they came in a great number, went to the Kikuyu and they took some parts of it as a white man's land. Although the Kikuyu are there, they didn't think much of them. They made them squatters, which meant that they had to work for the white men. And the Kikuyu before the white men came, especially in my own district, Kiambu. Land was very important in Kikuyu custom. That's how the land hunger came, because if the white men did not take their land, they would have had sufficient land to farm.
The Maasai were soon brought into line too. Their elders were called by His Majesty's Commissioner. In less than a week, a Maasai land agreement had been proposed, drafted, and signed as a legal document.
Being chiefs of the Maasai tribe, we have decided of our own free will to remove our people, flocks, and herds into definite reservations away from the railway line and any land that may be thrown open to European settlement. We undertake to vacate the whole of the Rift Valley to be used by the government for these purposes. We are quite satisfied with the foregoing arrangements, and we hereby bind ourselves and our successors, as well as our people, to observe them. Signed by Lenana, son of Mbatia, and 20 elders of the Maasai on August the 15th, 1904.
I can tell you, I'm sure the Maasais had no idea as to what agreement they were signing. I lived in Maasai country for many years. My father was a doctor in Maasai country for 15 years. And they certainly would not have understood, okay, they're giving up their lands. Goodness alone knows who actually drafted it and what they were told or they were signing. I certainly do not believe that they would have agreed to give up their lands voluntarily or otherwise to anybody.
In 1920, they declared that Kenya was now a British colony, not a protectorate. Then people understood that with the colony means that the soil is now belongs to the British. It belonged to the British Crown. In Kenya, it was an offense for an African to plant coffee, to plant tea, and to plant so many other crops which the European settlers were planting. And at the same time, your hen or your animal could not trespass into a European area. If it gets there, it is either killed or even you are taken and punished very severely. And these are areas where Africans used to live rather very freely, tilling the land rather freely, and so on. So the grievances were several and many.
They were not allowed to grow coffee in the areas adjoining the European coffee plantations because of the stated fear of, a very real fear indeed, of coffee berry disease, which, if they had not looked after their coffee plantations well, would have spread to and destroyed the European coffee plantations. They were allowed to plant coffee in 2 of the districts which were not adjacent to the European farms. When they did finally plant coffee as a cash crop, and this was the principal one which they were prevented from engaging in, they did it quite brilliantly. And their small holdings were as good as anything which could be seen. And indeed, later, the cooperative large holdings were as good as anything which could be seen on a European farm.
The idea was that if they did so, they would run their own farms. And the European settlers wanted them to be labor, cheap labor for the European farms. And Africans resented this, even when they were wealthy and they were rich and they were educated. And they were not allowed to grow these things. And it was, in my opinion, sheer discrimination.
Here was a case of European farmers actually demanding that Africans should come and work on their plantations. They were a source of cheap labor. And because in those days, collective bargaining, that was non-existent, the wages which were in fact paid to the Africans was never adequate, and that was another one of the major point of grievances.
The African soon proved a ready source of labor, for it had not taken him long to realize that he needed money, not only to pay the taxes which a European government had levied on him, but also to buy the European goods which were flooding into the African market. By leaving his village, and going to work for the European, that money could be earned. Life began to take on complications which were hard for the African to understand.
Some things were even harder for the European to understand, like the demands of African workers who soon began to sense they were being unfairly exploited.
They wanted more pay, and most of all, they didn't like Kipande. Kipande was a document that the African was supposed to carry everywhere he went, looking for a job.
Kipande stated the name and address and the home area from which he came, the location, his tribe, etc., etc. And then it had to record every single job he did, when he was employed and when he was dismissed. And if it turned out that at a particular time he didn't have employment, that was enough to be a vagrant. And if he was in any town or anything, that he was arrested. So, in fact, an African could not be in any one of the urban areas without employment. And that was very, very unfair to him, because if he wanted to come and seek employment, he was still committing a criminal offense.
Kipande was a sort of registration which was confined only to African labor. And it was necessary that an African must carry it everywhere. And the people hated it because it was not proper registration, but only to check on the Africans wherever they work.
By 1921, feelings were running high. Led by a young Kikuyu, Harry Thuku, demonstrations and protests rocked the colonial government. The main demand was the repeal of the Native Registration Act, known as Kipande. Harry Thuku himself dispatched a cable to the British Prime Minister. As the agitation spread and riots flared, Harry Thuku was arrested. He was Kenya's first nationalist to be detained.
We were then beginning to see the early manifestations in Kenya of what we now understand to be apartheid in South Africa. You remember the early settlers who came to Kenya. Most of them came from South Africa.
Well, the color bar in Kenya was, I'm afraid, absolute, exactly like apartheid in South Africa, except it didn't have that name. The residential areas, vast amounts of land were kept, housing areas were kept for Europeans. In the title deeds and the grants, no person other than of pure European descent could own a house there, could lease a house, could rent a house, could mortgage the house, could even be a guest in a house, except as a pure domestic servant. In the restaurants, the same thing. You had European restaurant licenses, you had Asian eating houses and African eating houses. And nobody was allowed to eat in an area of, in a restaurant of another race.
People began to talk openly in churches and outside against the colonial regime in Kenya. There were so many churches which even got started. Like in 1932, there was the Holy Ghost Church, which started just in this particular province, Nyanza. And there was also Dini ya Musambwa, which also started during that time. All their aim were that the time has come for European settlers to leave the land for the people.
It was the translation of the Bible's message into many Kenyan languages that started to have effects that the missionaries had not foreseen. Some of the new converts split from the establishment and began to set up their own independent churches. Others took a political message from the teachings of Christ.
I think that as Christian education, not only in Kenya, elsewhere, does produce a nationalist movement, that is a sort of side product. It is the gospel itself which sets people free and gives them dignity and gives them education, and then they see their lack of freedom and struggle for it. But the church as such doesn't have political and nationalist plans. It hasn't got that as a direct objective, and this would be true throughout Southern Africa and anywhere else. On the one hand, to function, you need to function with the authorities, with the establishment, and so you have to give ground there. But on the other hand, to have integrity, you have to press forward with your educational development, knowing all the time that in the end this will undermine the colonial regime.
This is the national and also the empire program. The Right Honourable Malcolm MacDonald, His Majesty's Secretary of State for the Colonies.
We who are responsible for the government of the British colonial empire are engaged upon a great adventure. The task is enormous. The problems are innumerable. We sometimes run into troubles, and our ultimate goal is still far away. Let us, in this present generation of colonial servants, see to it that the millions of our fellow citizens in the colonies are better off when we lay down our responsibilities than they were when we took them up.
The giving of responsibility is an essential part of Britain's policy in Africa. The first step towards self-government is to delegate responsibility to the councils of local tribes. Much of the progress in social welfare is in the hands of these councils. Here, the local chief has other responsibilities too. He collects taxes for the government.
The chiefs among the Kikuyu are not traditional. The British had to invent the word chief among the Kikuyu because they had no chiefs. And while they were promoted, they become government officials. So while all the time the British were in the colony, they were paid government civil servants, so that they always agreed with whatever the white men said. That's why the chiefs were not very popular among the Kikuyu.
Everywhere in East Africa, the chiefs administer their own courts of justice. The judge is the tribal chief.
They will come, and then they said that we want you to produce to us one of you to be the chief of this area. And then people will stand up, about 4 or 5, and then people will line behind them. And after lining behind them, they will register and said that, oh, we have seen. But of course they had come with somebody in their mind whom they wanted to be the chief. They said that you so and so, you have selected so and so, so and so, but King George has decided that so and so will be your chief. We refuse, but they won't care. They say, Kelele, he will be your chief.
But they had little influence on the Kikuyu Central Association, who elected a young man called Jomo Kenyatta as secretary. In 1931, he went to London to lobby for the return of tribal lands. Kenyatta was again in London in 1936 when the Italians invaded Ethiopia. This new aggression against Africa was an outrage, just when colonialism was beginning to be challenged elsewhere. In Britain, African students like Kenyatta were in the forefront of popular support for the Ethiopians.
He organized International African Friends of Abyssinia Society. And when the Emperor Haile Selassie arrived in London in exile, the first African to welcome him was none other than Jomo Kenyatta. And the effect here was that the Africans in London were aroused as to the importance of organizing themselves to demand future self-government and independence.
I came across in 1938 a statement made in the newspaper that a certain European settler who was their representative had asked the governor in the Registrar Council to give him any assurance that whenever there is a conflict between the land matters between the white and the black people, the interests of the white will always prevail over those of the native, the African native. I was angry and wrote a letter protesting about it. It was printed.
Henry Moria was already publishing political pamphlets for an African audience. But when the newspaper refused his second letter, he began to feel that African opinion needed new channels.
Then that's how I got the idea of owning a newspaper in which the African opinion would be expressed freely. The title of my newspaper was Mumenyereri, which means the caretaker.
What sort of things were in the paper?
The things were in the paper is just like to educate African people, about how to help themselves, and also So like black people, wage was very low, and their condition of living was very low. And that paper, he was writing to try to express about feeling of the people, how they feel and how they are put down in many ways.
How did people respond to the paper?
Oh, they like it very much because they see it's their need, what they need is what he's writing, and express for them in a paper, what they are feeling.
When political demands were discussed openly, the authorities suppressed them. The Kikuyu Central Association, which had been active for nearly 20 years, was banned in 1940. The colony was still governed by the all-white Legislative Council. Not until 1944 did they appoint the first African member, Eliud Mathu. But a single representative was not enough.
It was in 1944 when the British gave us chance to start a party which was called Kenya African Study Union. And people rejected, although they started Kenya African Study Union, but they rejected, saying that they have nothing to study. They know their problems already, and they want just direct representation in Parliament. And so, very soon, it was changed from Kenya African Study Union to Kenya African Union, which actually started meeting in large numbers everywhere to oppose the colonial regime. First of all, they started it very quietly by saying that they want only cooperation in the government. Later, they had to demand that they wanted to actually control the government.
Self-government became a demand soon after the war. By this time, African political ideas had been inspired by the visionaries like Marcus Garvey and Dr. Dubois in America, the Back to Africa movement, the Pan-African movement. Jomo Kenyatta had been to Europe and other people had been here too, and they'd been reading a lot about it. They were also inspired by Mahatma Gandhi's work in his fight for equality in South Africa and the freedom struggle in India, by the fight of the Ethiopian emperor for independence. And generally, the Atlantic Charter, the United Nations, a lot of propaganda that the West made during the war, fighting for freedom of the individual and freedom of countries, etc., that inspired everybody to say that, well, if everybody can be free, why not we? I mean, we've tried so hard for so many years to get justice and equality in this country, and we failed. And the only way we can do it now is to run our own country.
There was a great ferment among the Kikuyu. They were beginning to break out of a situation of being forest dwellers with shifting cultivation. And the resentment of the Kikuyu at the presence of Europeans in lands which they maintained to be theirs at the beginning of the century grew and grew. It first of all broke out in the 1920s during the time of Harry Thuku, went on through the Kikuyu Central Association, through the war when that association was proscribed, and emerged again at the end of the war, very much enlivened, very much more educated, and drawing on a great variety of influences, particularly among the Kikuyu.
As more and more Africans learned to read, political demands intensified, but the authorities still ignored them. The question of leadership became an issue.
I made a campaign in my newspaper to bring Jomo Kenyatta to Kenya because he had been here over 15 years. We tried to get a petition to the government to let the the Kikuyu Central Association become legal again because it was banned. The government refused. So the elders, as well as myself and others, thought the only person who is famous enough and could influence the governor was Jomo Kenyatta. Then I made a campaign of bringing him to Kenya.
The feeling was running very high everywhere, particularly when it was helped by Kenyatta, who has been in London, and had come with agitation. So he came back with actually proper and better explanation. And this actually woken people up, and then they become even militant.
As soon as Kenyatta returned, what he did was to commence countrywide tour, visiting all the provinces and districts, which eventually managed to secure the support of all, or at least major tribal groups, so that by 1947-48, 2 years after his return to Kenya, one could almost certainly say that Kenya managed to have the widest support of all the tribal groups.
But by now, the settlers were becoming more and more dominant. In 1949, they produced the Kenya Plan to secure white farming interests once and for all at the expense of Africans. They were aided and abetted by loyalist groups, including most of the tribal chiefs and elders. But the nationalist movement began to recruit the whole population, as younger radical politicians began to oppose the loyalists, the settlers, and the government. The focal point of the movement was land.
The agitation went on for a long time until it came to its end. By 1952, people were mad about it. Now, at that time, they were demanding, that is what it was, Mau Mau. Mau Mau was actually demand for soil, and later they changed their mind. They said that we want independence, complete rule by ourselves. Let us rule ourselves badly than other people ruling us well.
Gongola. Gongola. Gongola Mau Mau. Yuna numa makiama. Igua Mau Mau. Negoa. Jamene. Urakira Mau Mau. Negoa.
The idea of oathing and secret oathing ceremonies was in fact given impetus by the Kikuyu Central Association. The idea behind it was that we had now to unite behind the political organization, and we had to unite behind the political objectives and aims, so forth. And the second consideration was that in order to ensure that because the government authorities were against this organization, you were not going to report A or B or C who is a member of this organization or the office of that organization. And the Kikuyus in particular were known for supporting the concept of keeping secrecy as a way of keeping them united.
The first Mau Mau oath in this district started in 1948. That's when the first Mau Mau started this. In Kiambu, they started a bit earlier. But the first Mau Mau oath in the Muranga, in the Fort Hall district, started in August 1948. And all this is spread quietly without anybody knowing. And we start having people amazing. I mean, you come to this area, you find so and so is amazing nowhere and nobody to be found. It's all started like that, very quiet without anybody, and nobody knew. I was very lucky myself to have known what was going on with the Mau Mau, because my aunt, who comes from Kiambu, had taken the Mau Mau oath. And when she came here, she confessed to me and told me all about the Mau Mau. That's how I became suspicious about the Mau Mau.
I took the oath because I wanted independence. I took it in 1952, in the month of April. So then I became one of the freedom fighters. It was at that time I felt that I should make up my own mind. I should demand land and I should be a full adult. So that's why I took the oath.
On the 7th of October 1952, the Mau Mau struck. A loyalist chief, Waryuhu, was murdered. His funeral was attended by the governor, Sir Evelyn Baring. 4 days later, a white couple were attacked. The authorities took immediate action against what they called bandits. A state of emergency was declared.
Nairobi police have been supplemented by hundreds of civilians, many of them women, to help round up the Mau Mau bandits. Radio-controlled cars with armored vehicles are used to carry out the army's plans for bringing in all suspects. More than 3,500 have been arrested already. All have to be carefully checked by police security men, for in such a decisive swoop as this, it is all too easy for the innocent to suffer. The objective of this secret society is to drive all white men out of Kenya.
What they did is they detained or arrested Jomo Kenyatta and the national movement. Now, Jomo Kenyatta himself was against violence. He was a full nationalist. He wanted independence. He wanted everything, but he didn't want violence. But their idea was that if they detained Jomo Kenyatta and the leaders, they would be able in one fell swoop to not only quash Mau Mau, but to destroy the national movement. As I said, they felt the national movement was only caused because of these few troublemongers or troublemakers.
Jomo Kenyatta and the 5 nationalists arrested with him were put on trial at Kapenguria. They were charged with inciting the Mau Mau violence.
Kenyatta denies all charges and claims he is only seeking to cooperate with Europeans in Kenya.
In the trial, there was not a single witness who spoke truth. They were all just hearsay or somebody's dreaming of this and that, and we are very surprised that nothing had come in the way we were expecting, that they would bring people and accuse us of, though we were in the movement.
The trial lasted altogether 5 months, but its eventual outcome had never been in doubt.
The charges were trumped up. The evidence was not correct. In fact, the most senior, the witness who gave evidence against him, eventually confessed and said that he had been bribed by the authorities and offered a scholarship and so much money to go and give evidence against him.
The paying of witnesses at the Kapenguria trial is now an established fact. Detailed accounts of the money paid over were prepared and signed.
In fact, the director of public prosecutions then, a fellow called Samarov, told us during the trial that he himself believed that Kenyatta was not the leader of Mau Mau.
From the Cathedral of the Highlands in Nairobi are borne the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Roger Ruck and their 6-year-old son, Michael, a British family brutally murdered by the Mau Mau. Here in a lonely farmhouse, far from the comparative safety of the city, police dogs found the Rucks stabbed to death. Incensed by the murder of the Ruck family, 2,000 Europeans assemble outside Government House in Nairobi. Mr. Michael Blundell, leader of the European elected members, a body formed by the white settlers, strongly criticizes as ineffectual the present action being taken by the government. The feeling runs high among the settlers, for it is the ultimate aim of the Mau Mau to drive them all from Africa. Refused audience with the governor, Sir Evelyn Baring, the demonstrators attempt to storm Government House.
The settlers' community were the immediate problem for the Africans because they were the people who are owning the land, tilling the land, and who are mistreating Africans in their farms.
But the settlers had hardly recognized that there was a political problem at all. They found Mau Mau frightening and incomprehensible, especially when the violence was turned on other Africans. And when a whole group of loyalist Kikuyu were killed at Lari, near Limuru, the whites regarded it as an inexplicable reversion to savagery.
The Kikuyu growth of restiveness, of insurrection, of internal struggle among themselves, spiritually and physically, was something which was very, very difficult to pin down. And any action could have been counterproductive. Any failure to act was probably productive of worse things. but there was very, very little opportunity of seizing it by the neck and saying, you are a rebellion, we will stop it.
As the fighters built up their arms in the forest, the security forces stepped up their attacks. The Kikuyu Reserve became a free fire zone.
During this period, many people were killed. The estimated figure I've seen is something like 11,000 Africans were killed.
At Nyeri, some miles north of Nairobi, Kikuyu Home Guard and other African police gather for a tribal meeting. This baraza, as it's called, has been arranged so the tribesmen may learn of the latest developments in the war against Mau Mau. Wearing their traditional costumes, about 11,000 wait in silence for the arrival of the governor of Kenya, Sir Evelyn Baring. Then Sir Evelyn outlines a new plan, an amnesty offer to the terrorists. Fundamentally, this means that any Mau Mau, whatever his past crimes, will not be hanged if he surrenders immediately. The governor then presents medals to police who have shown exemplary courage in clashes with Mau Mau. Whilst this ceremony is in progress, thousands of leaflets bearing the amnesty offer are dropped in Mau Mau territories. Already there has been fierce condemnation of the amnesty plan in Kenya. It has been described as exactly the same as offering Hitler an amnesty in 1943. However, supporters of the plan believe it is a worthwhile attempt to restore peace in the troubled land of the Mau Mau.
Well, this phenomenon of Mau Mau, it was, I think, seen as a revolt, largely, and it wasn't seen as a political movement as we came to see it later on. It was seen largely as a revolt of the Kikuyu of the central province, and so it had limited sympathy and limited understanding. Its social and political aspects only emerged, I think, much later, or perhaps we were slow to grasp.
The authorities had worked out that the forest fighters must be getting support in the countryside. So, in suspected areas, the security forces started forcibly moving people out of their homes. The houses were then destroyed, and the areas cleared. The people were relocated to protected villages specially constructed in places where they could be patrolled by the police. But neither the amnesty nor the villagization halted the violence. Even more drastic measures were then introduced, with the idea of cutting off the fighters from their support in the capital.
The whole process, which was called Operation Anvil, arrested and detained a whole mass of the Kikuyu people, not only those in Nairobi, but also those outside. This Operation Anvil was supposed to be a once and for all, as it were, operation to get rid of the Mau Mau supporters.
Over 50,000 suspects were detained in the next few weeks as the authorities tried to get loyalists to identify who were the Mau Mau supporters.
So come on. None you met, eh? Mau Mau Mau.
Acha.
Why you Neko?
Kawaicha.
You told our location?
Charo.
Wana, this man was with me last night. I know him. He's a good man.
Karachini.
The headman seems a pretty responsible chap.
Oh, he is, as far as any of them are.
His son's a doctor, isn't he?
Yeah, Peter Karanja. Have you met?
No, but Mary's told me all about it.
Yeah, she thinks a lot of him.
And you don't?
I have a nasty, suspicious mind. Always a bit wary of educated natives.
But locking up many thousands of Mau Mau suspects failed to halt the nationalist movement. And even the colonial government began to question the effects of mass detention.
When you have 80,000 or more people in detention, it is clearly, not only physically, but morally and politically untenable for longer than a certain period. It is easy enough to whittle them down by ordinary opening of the gates over a period of time. And if the opening of the gates is supported by discussions on a religious basis, using the fundamentals of tribal as well as religious ethics to wean them away from the things which Mau Mau had been doing. It was relatively, not easy, but it was relatively fast that, say, 60, 70,000 or more would be released. Now, there were left something towards 20,000 who were not amenable to this kind of treatment, this kind of opening of the gates approach. And in any event, it was regarded by the people at home, the people who were, shall we say, in support of the government position. It was regarded by them as dangerous that they should be released willy-nilly. At this stage, the government decided that there should be a program of, quotes, rehabilitation, which meant that these people should be induced by one means or another, and I don't mean that in a menacing sense, to change their ways sufficiently to be released home without further disturbance and reversion to the period of warlike violence.
It took, as I recall, two different forms. One was the process of asking people to believe now in God and Christianity. Lots of priests and other church leaders were used to do that, insisting that they should denounce Mau Mau and that they should denounce, even come to that, Jomo Kenyatta, the already imprisoned leader. The cleansing ceremony was a peculiar phrase because in the old days, the Kikuyus used to have what they call the cleansing ceremony. If, for example, you are suspecting certain evils or devils were haunting your family and that your cows, your children, or your wives were being attacked, they would use some sort of cleansing ceremony by eating some pieces of meat and drinking some sort of wine. How you could possibly cleanse one from deeply held political convictions, that is always very difficult to understand.
It wasn't easy to get an understanding of Mau Mau. And that was partly because all our means of information were controlled by newspapers and government. And it was only by talking with people and doing a little thinking on your own you could see beyond. I mean, you take Kenyatta, for example. How could we get a balanced understanding of Jomo Kenyatta, the man put on trial, the man who was described by the governor, the leader to darkness rather than light? Well, now that seemed to fit the profile. And it wasn't easy to get an understanding of Jomo Kenyatta as the leader, the nationalist leader to independence and self-determination. I mean, his books were banned, and books about him facing Mount Kenya and so on were unavailable. And so that you could only pick up newspaper reports on the trial and so forth. So to get an understanding of what that Mau Mau movement was really about and what Jomo Kenyatta was really about was not easy to grasp.
Jomo Kenyatta was the recognized leader of the non-cooperation movement which organized Mau Mau. Mau Mau, with its foul-loathing and violent aims, had been declared an unlawful society. He was convicted of managing that unlawful society and being a member of it. He appealed to the Supreme Court and the Privy Council. In these three separate courts, his guilt was established and confirmed.
His Excellency the Governor has called you an evil man who would lead to darkness and to death. What are your feelings on this?
Well, that is lie. I think there is no grain of truth in that. Because my whole life, I have been trying to uplift my people to better ways of life.
In my view, Jomo Kenyatta's release would be at present a danger to security. The decision is mine. By this statement, I wish to make it clear that accordingly, he will remain under restriction.
Are you now, at this time, prepared to condemn outright all excesses so far as the Mau Mau were concerned in the past?
Well, not only Mau Mau, but I think all violence. I am non-violent myself.
Renison refused to release Kenyatta. He said he couldn't release Kenyatta because Kenyatta to him was a leader of darkness and death. And so he wasn't going to release Kenyatta. And we then adopted the attitude that, or what we thought was a tactic, that we should get into government and having sort of a measure of control on it, on internal affairs, we might then use it to release Kenyatta.
Kenyatta and others were still in detention, but by now the Legislative Council had several elected African members. In 1960, internal self-government was granted, but Kenyatta's party, KANU, refused to take part. It was the British government that finally realized that Kenyatta would have to be released if a lasting political settlement was ever to be achieved. Pressure was put on Governor Renison to change his mind, and Kenyatta's long detention was ended by the stroke of a pen.
Well, the signing of the proclamation means the bringing to the end of all emergency restrictions. It's been a particular joy to me to be able to sign this proclamation today. I regarded that as the first task I had to carry on the work of my predecessor and bring this emergency to an end. I'm delighted that we were able to do it at this particular time. I think it was extraordinarily important that if we could, we should end this emergency before we went to London for our constitutional conference.
Lancaster House has staged many colonial conferences, but this was the first one with picturesque touches. Headdresses with lion's mane cloaks indicate the importance of the tribal leaders. The conference discussed the future of Kenya. Jomo Kenyatta, perhaps the outstanding African in his country, desires a central government. Mr. Ngala, his chief opponent, prefers a federation of regions not dominated by the Kikuyu tribe. Colonial Secretary Reginald Maudling hopes for a constitution that will guarantee equality before an impartial law.
Looking back today, I am glad to be able to say that KANU is proud of its contribution at this conference. We are fully prepared to cooperate in the task ahead and invite all other parties and sections to work with us in this noble task.
People were apprehensive what this was going to mean. And when Jomo Kenyatta came to power, then there was a remarkable change overnight. I remember the incident when Jomo Kenyatta met the white farmers of Molo and the White Highlands, and they filled the hotel and listened to him speak.
We are not angels, we're human beings. And as such, we are bound to make mistakes. But we have a great gift which we can exercise, and that is to forgive one another. If I have done mistake to you, it's for you to forgive me. If you have done to me, I say it's for me to forgive you.
And here was this leader to darkness who was seen immediately from his words to be a person of great magnanimity. He said to his followers, we will show these whites that we can rule them far better, more humanely than they ruled us.
The change was that here is a man who is no longer a terrorist. He's now not only a Kenya Prime Minister and a statesman, but a man of considerable international stature. That was a major response and a positive response on the part of Europeans towards him.
There were a lot of people in Kenya who believed that the white farms should be taken away from the settlers by force and given to Africans. They argued that after all, the Europeans took away our farms by force and didn't give us any compensation. Why should we, now that we've got freedom, have to pay compensation to the settlers, because they paid us nothing? And Kenyatta said, no, whatever happened, that's historical. But as far as the present is concerned, we have got to respect the private titles and private properties of every person, whether they are European settler farmers or Indian shopkeepers. And if any European farmer has got to be, bought out, then he should be bought out on a willing buyer, willing seller basis.
I, Jomo Kenyatta, being chosen and admitted to the cabinet in Kenya, do swear that I will be true and faithful to Kenya, and that I will, to the best of my judgment, freely give my counsel and advice for the good management of the public affairs of Kenya. I think it was the British Prime Minister, Mr. Macmillan, who told us some time ago that we must adopt ourselves in the wind of change. Nobody knew at that time what or how that wind of change would blow towards our shores here. It has come. The wind of change is here with us.
At midnight, the Union Jack was lowered for the last time, and Kenya ceased to be a colony and became independent. Good luck to Kenya in her new role as an independent nation.
Tell me, my friend and comrade, do you remember the night of Uhuru, when the celebration drums throbbed and men and women wept with joy as they danced, their hands raised to salute our national flag? Did someone tell you the dew on the grass along the village pathways would turn into gold? We have property and wealth. We are in power.